Greetings, everyone. Welcome back again. I'll say the name of our panel before we get started, and then I'll invite our panelists to begin when they're ready. So we're about to open up ourselves to receive a presentation entitled Faith, Hope, and Love as Embodied Disciplines and Practices Within Liberatory Anti-Violence Movements. Please welcome our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Chanel. I am now going to not succeed in sharing my screen. One moment. So we are, what have I done? I'm sorry. I'm so bad at screen sharing. Can everyone see this? Perfect. Thank you. So we'll be speaking about faith, hope, and love as embodied disciplines and practices, as Chanel introduced us. And each of us will be speaking on one topic. So I'm going to speak a bit this morning, it's morning for me here in California, about faith in relation and in correlation to the abolition and community accountability, transformative justice, and other anti-violence movements, and what thinking about faith theologically can offer to those movements, and also what we can learn from them through a correlative methodology. I'm speaking about faith here in a theological sense, using that definition. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And I think the first immediate connection that can be made with the prison industrial complex abolition movement is the idea of abolition as proleptic participation in the eschatological reign of God. When we think about the coming reign of God as a time of justice that will be characterized by life and liberation and not by prisons, to understand prison abolition, the abolition of prisons and policing, as something that occurs in our world now, requires an act of faith. It is a prolepsis and a participation in advance in the peaceable reign to come. This is really central to my understanding of what Christianity has to offer abolitionist movements and what Christianity can gain from abolitionist movements. To put it in terms of that are used by abolition practitioners, we could name it as being accountable to that future we can't yet see. The practice of abolition requires us to understand it as a participation in a coming future that is not yet in place. And this requires faith, that conviction of things not seen. What does that look like in practice? What does that look like in an embodied way? Abolitionist and transformative justice practitioner Mariame Kaba talks about the fact that in the world of abolition of prisons and policing, in the transformative justice movement, there's not just one alternative to the prison industrial complex, but that instead there are all sorts of efforts that are coming up, a multiplicity of efforts coming from different practitioners. So she says that restorative justice, transformative justice, community accountability, these terms that are used for liberatory anti-violence movements and practices, can't be named as the alternative to the carceral state, in part because they are always voluntary and non-coercive, because they derive from particular communities and particular situations rather than out of a totalizing impulse. And so so abolition is characterized by building alternatives without a universalizing answer, by beginning to start an experiment without a universal or totalizing understanding of the goal of what a world without prisons and police looks like. 1 Million Experiments, which is a podcast and website and zine that gathers these experiments, carries out this sort of characteristic understanding of abolition, that it is a sense of experimenting, that communities are experimenting with different community safety-based alternatives. And what does this have to do with faith? From my perspective, this gives us, among other things, a way of understanding our proleptic participation in the reign of God as Christians outside of a totalizing understanding of the church. It says it is not about having one system here by which we understand God's justice, but that instead every experiment that is coming out of an affected community and every experiment which attempts to build abolition is in some sense a participation in what we as Christians might call divine justice or the reign of God. That this is an eschatological reality of peace which we can experience in ways that bubble up in our current reality with real material consequences, but not requiring any sort of totalizing power over. Abolitionist Ruth Wilson Gilmore says frequently that abolition is life in rehearsal, that we are rehearsing this reality that we want to come. And I want to suggest that that rehearsal is, again, an act of faith, that we have this conviction of a reality is coming, and so we are rehearsing it. And indeed, that I think by rehearsing this liberation, again, to turn to theological terms, we are enacting it in a way that I would call a sacramental practice, naming sacraments as those things which truly enact what they also symbolize. And so I think it can be a helpful correlation to think of abolition as a sort of a sacrament, something mediated by the Holy Spirit, a sacrament which enacts our practice of liberation as we rehearse it. So as we build experiments, as we build alternatives, as we build anti-violence practices outside of the carceral state, we are rehearsing for the future we want to see, and we are bringing it into being in these small ways. And to think about the role of the Holy Spirit, I think, again, from a theological perspective, it's helpful to look at the passage in John chapter 20, when Jesus says to the disciples, receive the Holy Spirit, and that the immediate consequence of that is what Martin Luther called the office of the keys, the binding and loosing of sins, that if you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven, and if you retain them, you are retained. And while that's not a perfect analog to the work of accountability done in communities, I think there is an analog there to the idea that the Holy Spirit empowers us in Christian communities and provides a framework for building what activist Connie Burke calls accountable communities, for building a practice of accountability within our communities, for understanding the forgiveness and repentance of sins as something which involves the work of accountability. And I think that faith is at play there, that the Holy Spirit and faith mediate this sort of sacrament of the new creation through the building of accountability. Accountable communities, which is given to the church. So I'd like to turn briefly here to talk about the role of faith in these accountability practices and what it looks like as we build accountable communities together. I'm drawing here a little bit on Kierkegaard's definition of faith on the strength of the absurd, of faith as that which allows for paradox, for contradiction, and for multiplicity. Because in addition to this bubbling up of experiments in abolitionist practice, I think we see contradiction and multiplicity in our attempts to grapple with accountability and transformative justice. So one concept which comes out of transformative justice, which I find particularly helpful as an analog for this sort of faith, is the concept of Venn diagrams. Venn diagrams from E.M. Ilana Eisen-Markowitz and Rachel Schragas is a practice for holding two contradictory ideas at the same time without a dialectical synthesis. So the diagram, the idea for clarifying your thinking, is a Venn diagram in which the center is intentionally left empty. And so it allows us to recognize the contradictions that come about when we really grapple with harm in a liberatory way. So for example, I think this one that I've shown is most helpful, that we have to do transformative justice, we have to believe in people's capacity for transformation, but also trust people when they show you who they are, to be realistic about what people have shown us. A similar Venn diagram that is helpful is to say, we wish for those who have done harm to have all the support and care they need in order to be accountable. And yet, often those who have been harmed hold a desire for vengeance or punishment, and that is also a valid feeling that has to be grappled with in the accountability process. And so the idea of these Venn diagrams is to allow for this multiplicity to be central to the work of accountability, to allow for these ideas to both be held at the same time. And I think I would suggest that that requires, again, an act of faith, that requires faith in something we can't yet see, to recognize that there is not a visible synthesis, and yet there is a way of holding these ideas at once. So looking at accountability processes, and this staircase of accountability comes from the Creative Interventions Toolkit, a transformative justice resource. And it is particularly aimed at those who have done harm, thinking about being accountable in their community. But we have to recognize that an accountability process in the community always requires accountability from the person who has done harm and support from the outside, from the community as a whole. And I think that is, again, where from a Christian perspective, we can look at the role of faith in the unseen, or in the paradoxical and the multiplicitous, as essential to allowing for this sort of process to happen. In a few places at the beginning, right, the beginning of a process requires faith. It requires that Venn diagram that I just showed, that we believe in someone's capacity for change while also being realistic and trusting who they have shown they already are. And to hold that sort of tension requires faith at the beginning. It also requires a sort of faith of forgiveness. And I think the term forgiveness is much less comfortable for me than accountability. I think that the way in which the church has used forgiveness has done great harm in many ways. And yet, if we try to tease apart what we mean by forgiveness, it is certainly true that community accountability and transformative justice require a sort of commitment to compassion, to human dignity, to non-punitiveness. The abolitionist, the liberatory anti-violence framework requires that we reject punishment or the imposition of suffering. And I believe that's also an act of faith, to allow for that sort of compassion and non-punitiveness. I think that then during this process, as somebody is trying to be accountable and as a community is holding the tension that arises through the process of truth-telling and repair, that requires faith in the community, to go again to the idea of the Christian community perhaps as a space mediated by the Spirit to be able to do this work of accountability, that to hold that tension, what Nils Christie describes as community property. He describes conflict as a property of the community that we should not give up to institutions like police and prisons, but should instead hold and work through. And that requires a faith in our community in order to be able to do that. And the community is structured by faith. And then I think, although an accountability process in the transformative justice framework ends with becoming a healthy member of the community, not necessarily with any sort of forgiveness, but I think there is always a hope of reconciliation within these movements, and the possibility of forgiveness is there. And this is where, again, I think correlating faith with forgiveness is essential here, going back to Kierkegaard and his view of faith as a teleological suspension of the ethical. And specifically, I draw that out in relation to forgiveness to emphasize that forgiveness is not a universal command, that for Kierkegaard, the ethical is that which is universal, and forgiveness cannot be that, because we cannot demand that people forgive or demand that reconciliation occur. But nonetheless, that there is the possibility of forgiveness somehow occurring outside of the ethical in a sort of suspension. And so I think these are all places where faith can come through in an accountability process. Thank you. And I will pass it on now to Jimmy, who's going to talk about hope.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I really appreciate your presentation. So I, too, am going to share a screen. And then let's do that. And are you all seeing the presentation slide or the slide I see? Do I need to switch? I'm on multiple computer screens.
I think we are seeing what you see with the next slide.
Okay, so I'm going to swap it, and now it should be good. Yes? Excellent. Thank you all so much. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I'm going to be talking a little bit about hope in the faith, hope, and love triumvirate, as we think about that in relationship to liberatory anti-violence movements. And I'm in conversation here with a few different folks. I'm in conversation with people who work in prison industrial complex abolition and transformative justice, the kind of community accountability processes and communities that Hannah was discussing, as well as conversations recently in Christian social ethics in the United States, mostly in conversation and argument with Miguel de la Torre about the call for folks from marginalized and oppressed communities to embrace hopelessness. And then the language and thinking around moral imagination in peace studies and conflict transformation. And I'm bringing those discourses together. So broadly speaking, I've got a few summaries of hope in the Christian tradition that I point to as kind of representative of how contemporary theologians and ethicists think about this, especially as it comes out of formulations from Aquinas, right? So we've got something like a disposition by which we commune with something bigger than us, something beyond what our everyday human experience lets us know about, a distinction between hope as a natural passion and as a theological virtue, both of which sit kind of in that same realm of disposition. And then also from Eleanor Marshall, the sense of possibility that generates and sustains moral agency. So even more explicitly here, a sense of possibility as it relates to the moral life. And so broadly, I think what we see in the way that most folks have been thinking about hope from Christian communities and in Christian theological circles in, let's say, the last 20 years or so, has been with this emphasis on the idea of disposition towards something greater than what we might experience in our day-to-day lives. You'll see similar kinds of definitions in work from folks as different as Nancy Pineda Madrid to Emily Towns to a whole host of others, often drawing on various figures throughout the Christian theological tradition, but especially St. Thomas Aquinas. And so that's kind of what I would describe as the broad scope of the way that hope is understood, something that orients us toward both God and possible futures bigger than ourselves. But that's recently become critiqued, especially in some liberatory circles, liberation theology and ethics and Christian social ethics, primarily by Miguel de la Torre and a few other folks who've drawn on his work. Though it's not limited there, you see similar things outside of Christian ethics. For example, in the United States, Ta-Nehisi Coates' recent memoir, Between the World and Me, written as a letter to his son, also talks about the need to embrace hopelessness in the midst of racial violence and injustice in the United States. And so there are many reasons why hope is rejected in this work. For De La Torre in particular, it's rejected as a middle-class privilege, as only really possible when one's privilege enables enough security to hope for the future, as an excuse not to deal with the reality of injustice, and as something that impedes the possibilities for engaging in revolutionary action, right? So hope is something that gets in the way of the most oppressed people finding, making, building their liberation, right? And so he encourages something like embracing hopelessness, because this would allow folks from marginalized communities to stop buying into mainstream systems and structures and modes of thinking that are so dominated by colonialist and capitalist forms of thought and ways of shaping the world, that as long as we continue to buy in, it makes true revolution not possible. And so we should reject hope and then embrace something like hopelessness, which then makes possible radical, risky action for liberation. In this work, he's especially critical of Jürgen Moltmann's theologies of hope, but not exclusively so. I don't want to spend too much time there because the majority of De La Torre's work, as I read it, sits in thinking about hope, not necessarily as it is oriented to the divine, but how it's oriented to the ways that we move through contemporary societies, as something like a disposition of finding something better in the tomorrow. Right? I'd argue that the scope of hope there isn't necessarily always in total alignment with the way that hope is thought about by theologians and ethicists working in and with marginalized and oppressed communities. But that's another paper that I published a little while back. But this sense of climate change, neoliberal global capitalism, the continued presence of racialized violence and injustice, mass incarceration, and on and on. Many thinkers on our social and political life with one another have said something like we should embrace hopelessness. But not all folks do that. So I have defined hope in earlier work as both this disposition, but then also what I call an empowering grace which compels the faithful to live a new world into existence. And I want to sit there a little bit. Live a new world into existence as the way that hope manifests. And this is not dissimilar to some of the stuff that Hannah shared just a few minutes ago, thinking about faith. But here, hope is not only disposition, but also a way of being and acting in the world. I want to think about that as a form of social practice. And here I'm drawing very explicitly on Carrie Day's work in thinking about the resistance of Black women in the United States and around the world, as well as other women of color around the world in resisting neoliberal global capitalism. And so she describes hope as the sets of collective practices that resist and protest what she calls the hegemony of the visible, right? So the world that we see, she's explicitly thinking about neoliberal economic and political structures and the way they'll show up in our cultural and day-to-day lives. And she describes hope as these collective practices that actually make it possible to resist what seems like the only way we can live in the world. And I want to lean into that as an insight that's worth holding on to in understanding transformative justice movements. And so Mariame Kaba, who's already been cited, is a leading thinker in transformative justice work. And she describes hope as choosing differently and taking concrete actions, because there's always potential for transformation and for change, whether that's good or bad. Very resonant with conflict transformation theory, right? Conflict is an opportunity for the transformation of relationships, individuals, social structures, political structures, etc. It's not just something to be resolved. It's not inherently negative, but conflict is an opportunity for transformation. And here in transformative justice, we see something similar working. And so she says elsewhere that hope is really believing in spite of the evidence and watching the evidence change. She's drawing explicitly on progressive evangelical activist Jim Wallace in the United States there. But I want to argue that actually what hope is, when understood as a social practice in transformative justice movements, is making the evidence change by living that new world into existence, if you remember my earlier definition. In particular, it's a social practice of moral imagination. So hope is a way of practicing moral imagination with others. This is the way that John Paul Lederach, a leading thinker in peace building and conflict transformation, describes moral imagination. I want to point to, in particular, ideas about interdependence, web of relationships here, this paradoxical curiosity, creative acts, and the inherent risk of acting differently in the world. And so hope as a social practice of transformative justice looks something like this definition from Kaba of TJ as both political vision, structural analysis of oppression, and practical organizing strategy that has this vision of a different society, of a different world where we have everything we need. And the way this shows up is in lots of different ways in transformative justice. Sometimes communities of accountability, as Hannah was describing earlier. Sometimes rethinking justice as forms of healing rather than primarily punishment. And you see similar kinds of rhetorics in restorative justice movements, as well as in folks dealing with historical trauma, and a whole host of other kinds of spaces where justice is understood primarily as the healing of harms that have occurred to people rather than the punishment of those who have caused those harms, right? Other ways this shows up is imagining a world in practice where we don't put people in cages, right? Or where, as Kaba says, a world where we have everything that we need. And so thinking explicitly about the ways that capitalism contributes to the ways we don't. And so mutual aid collectives are a common transformative justice practice that seeks to lean into a world where we care for each other and meet each other's needs. And then Adrienne Marie Brown and others talk about transformative justice work as science fictional behavior, as creating worlds that don't yet exist in which we could live differently. And so what I want to suggest is, as we look at contemporary activism around responding to violence in our communities and in our lives and in our society and our structures, and with transformative justice as kind of a cousin or a sibling of prison abolition work, is to think about the work that is happening as collectives of people come together to do these things, to care, to heal, to build solidarity, and to science fiction with one another. I want to encourage us to think about, in those spaces, that is what hope looks like. So it's not only disposition, but it is collective and social practice. And when understood in that way, I see no reason why marginalized and oppressed communities should embrace hopelessness, but rather should lean in ever more into hope. And so these are some of my references here for that. I can share it afterwards, but I want to cede my time to Johanna, so that we can then follow up and have a conversation with you all. So I'm going to end my share and then pass the mic.
Thank you, Jimmy. And as you'll hear, you know, we are there. You're going to hear a lot of overlap in our presentations, which I think is a good thing. As I'm going to talk about love, and so just to know, you'll hear some themes again as I share. Let me see if I can get my slides up here. Oh, I'm pressing the wrong button. Here we go. All right. So I'm going to talk about love, and I'm actually going to first just situate myself a little bit before I begin my reflections. So to position myself in terms of location, I'm joining you from the Haldeman Tract land promised to the Six Nations of the Grand River in 1784 from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Tonawanda, and Haudenosaunee peoples. And in talking about the ethic of love and liberatory anti-violence movements, I also want to locate myself as a US American immigrant, a scholar situated primarily in peace and conflict studies, as a Christian with Anabaptist sensibilities, as a radical Black feminist, as a survivor of intimate violence, among other forms, and as a prison abolitionist. And in this presentation, rather than providing a theological reflection on liberatory anti-violence movements, I want to think about what liberatory anti-violence movements can offer to a deepened and an expanded understanding of the Christian social ethic of love in the face of interpersonal and state violence. And specifically, I'm drawing from womanist and Black feminist methods of doing Christian social ethics, which center the role of Black women's lived experiences and moral wisdom, Black women's literary works and fiction, and social movements led by women of color. And it's especially in this area of social movements that I'm going to linger. I'm also referencing the work of Carrie Day explicitly in that same text that Jimmy just quoted from, but there are a couple of rich chapters on love, and in one of those, Day says, Black feminist and womanist discourses turn to how social movements among women of color offer a, quote, a prophetic politics of the ordinary that enflesh love or beloved communities. So building on this idea and specifically probing this claim, I'm attending to the articulations, the well springs, and the manifestations of love within women of color-led liberatory anti-violence movement building, which seeks to challenge intimate and state forms of violence simultaneously, and particularly forms of sexual and domestic violence within family and community relationships, as well as challenging the violence of policing in prisons by refusing to rely on policing in prisons as a way of challenging intimate and other forms of interpersonal violence. I'm going to pause here just to say that given my focus, which includes some direct discussion of sexual violence, including sexual abuse experienced by children, I want to encourage you to attend to your own body, mind, and spirit throughout. And please feel free to take a break or leave if necessary. I'm going to focus primarily on resistance. People are resisting and intervening in the face of these forms of violence. Bell Hook's large body of work on the ethic of love calls for religious and spiritual teachings on love, particularly biblical teachings, to be embodied in the way we relate within families, create new cultural norms, and formulate social policy. Bell Hooks often defines herself as a Buddhist Christian. She draws quite a bit and on a wide range of texts, but especially Christians, particularly Christian scripture, in terms of the kinds of sacred texts that she draws on in her work. In All About Love, the first text of her trilogy on love, Hooks writes in reference to the US, while ours is a nation wherein the majority of citizens are followers of religious faiths that proclaim the transformative power of love, many people feel that they do not have a clue as to how to love. And practically everyone suffers a crisis of faith when it comes to realizing biblical theories about the art of loving in everyday life. And I want to suggest that Bell Hooks, in addition to offering a theoretical formulation of love, is actually offering also a theoethical formulation of love. And in this formulation of love, love is simultaneously spiritual and political. It's oppositional to fear. Here she draws especially on 1 John 4:18, talking about there is no fear in love, a transforming love. Love is a transformative power. Love is teachable and learnable. It's not instinctual. Love is practice and action. Here she draws on psychologist Eric Fromm. Love is choice and will. She draws on the work of M. Scott Peck. Love is healing nurture. Love is a creative art. Love is antithetical to abuse, and love is non-punitive and non-negligent. She also talks about how love is enabled both by divine power, but also social and political conditions. And I'm not going to talk about all of these aspects of the ethic of love as defined, or the theoethics of love as defined by Black feminist Bell Hooks. However, I want to suggest that liberatory anti-violence movements embody this theo ethic. And as I continue, I want to highlight a few faces of this love ethic that are embodied in liberatory anti-violence movements, particularly dimensions that are underemphasized in dominant Christian ethics and ecclesial responses to intimate and state violence. One is the idea of love as choice in creativity that is particularly can be easily envisioned when we think about the conception of neighbor love. Bell Hooks draws from psychologist M. Scott Peck in emphasizing love as a choice. Quote, "Love is as love does. Love is an act of will, namely both an intention and an action. Will also implies choice. We do not have to love, we choose to love." And I hope we choose love, a trans girl's notes from the end of the world writer, cultural worker, conflict transformation coach Kai Cheng Thom urges social justice activists to, quote, "try understanding justice through an ethic of love," and to cultivate a love-based justice that, quote, "invests deeply and fervently in the dignity of human life, is grounded in the recognition that no one is disposable, and sets and enforces boundaries when violence occurs." Creative Interventions, which you heard Hannah refer to earlier, is a liberatory anti-violence organizing project that emerged from the experiences of Mimi Kim, who was then an anti-violence advocate working in domestic violence resource centers located within U.S. Asian immigrant communities. Many of the women that she encountered in her work who experienced domestic violence, they couldn't go to the police for a variety of reasons, or they did not want to go to the police. And so partnering with prison abolitionists, activists, Rachel Persing, and a small team of other organizers, they connected community organizing to the work of anti-violence intervention by inviting particularly women who experience abuse to invite family, friends, members of their faith communities, colleagues, anyone who could potentially support an intervention to the table. And then led by a creative interventions facilitator, they figured out strategies to intervene without any connection to the criminal legal system. For example, friends might take turns ensuring that a woman experiencing domestic abuse who doesn't want to leave her home is never left alone with an abusive partner. And after 2 years of facilitating those interventions, they put together that manual of resources that Hannah shared from, that staircase of accountability. It's actually an over 600-page manual of tools and resources that can be used by everyday people to intervene in interpersonal violence. This approach to organizing everyday people in the work of intimate violence prevention, intervention, and response reflects the practice of love as a choice to intervene and prevent harm from continuing to occur. A practice that Jesus highlights in the story of the intervening Samaritan bystander. For those of us who read this story and believe in the ethic of love at its center, Creative Interventions offers a guide to embodying this neighbor love in the form of practical action. Like Hooks, Black feminists, Christian ethicists, and theological scholars also affirm such love as a creative practice. Karen Guth, the attendant ethic According to religious studies scholar Karen Guth, the attendant ethic of creativity and womanist conceptions of love includes an emphasis on, this is a quote, "the dignity of human beings as creators and a construal of human agency as participation in God's creative activity, an understanding of this activity as involving a critique of the status quo and conformity, and an affirmation that such creative activity is redemptive." Liberatory anti-violence organizers offer a pedagogy of love as not only a choice we make to get involved when violence is occurring or has occurred, but it's a creative intervention that relies on the resources we have at our disposal. And we see this in Jesus' story of the intervening Samaritan, the way that he actually remakes, for example, an inn into a place of refuge for someone who has been wounded and abused. Another ethic of the faces of this ethic of love that are important to consider are truth-telling and accountability. For Hooks, to conceptualize love as a choice, love as an action, rather than a feeling, emphasizes accountability and responsibility. Yet truth-telling and accountability, as we know, are underemphasized as practices of agape love in both religious and secular contexts, if we want to affirm such a binary, which of course is a false binary. Speaking of the application of unconditional love in the face of violence and oppression, Melanie L. Harris, a scholar of Black feminist thought and womanist theology, has shared, "There is a thorn in my flesh about how this fierce love and compassion is actually lived out when it comes to holding an abuser or oppressor accountable and, quote, loving them in a justice sense, disallowing them to harm themselves or harm others. Love with Accountability is an edited volume of essays, poetry, interviews, and stories that was compiled, that was put together, that was curated by Black feminist activist, writer, lecturer, storyteller, and filmmaker Aisha Shahida Simmons, that calls for loving attention to child sexual abuse within diasporic Black communities, a love with accountability. This love with accountability, in the words of Darnell Moore, a pro-Black feminist, anti-violence activist and writer, is a love, an ethic of love that is a reckoning. He says love with accountability is a reminder that reckon is in fact an act of love. Accountability is real love, it is radical love, and it is a just love that we need. In the foreword to Love with Accountability, Moore tells the story of the time that he met a cousin in a bar to hang out one evening, and she discloses that she was molested by one of their family members. And he says that, "I didn't know what to do with the love that I felt, which began to feel too expansive a sentiment in a moment when what was needed was a reckoning." Now, he talks about how he affirms his belief in what happened to her, that he commits himself to walk alongside her in her journey toward healing. But he also says, "And I am reminded after reading this work, Love with Accountability, that if I love the family member who harmed my cousin, then I have to be ready to be honest with him about the need for accountability." Simmons developed the Love with Accountability project. So it's more than just a book. It was also an interactive online forum, a book, and many different components after her own experience of calling her own parents to account for their failure to intervene in her molestation by her pop-pop, her step-grandfather, the only paternal grandfather that she's known. And in challenging her parents to take accountability in a number of ways, including through writing them letters and emails to communicate with them about their failure to believe her when she told them about this starting when she was 10 years old, to stop leaving her at her grandparents' house when they were traveling on international human rights trips. Both of them were activists. Her mother, Gwendolyn Sahara Simmons, was actually also very vocal in calling out sexual harm within the US civil rights movement. Calling them to account to confront her grandfather when he was alive. She began ending her emails and texts them with the words "love with accountability." She says, "In so doing, I was emphasizing that my deep love for them would no longer shield their lack of accountability for the violence that I endured as a result of their inaction for 2 years and subsequent cover-up for 31 years. And the purpose of the Love with Accountability project," said Simmons, "is to, quote, examine how accountability is a powerful and necessary form of love needed to address child sexual abuse." Nearly all of the contributors to the volume Love with Accountability, most of whom are survivors of CSA, child sexual abuse, they advance restorative and transformative justice, and including a vision of a world without prisons and policing as the practice of love with accountability that they desired when they were children. Other liberatory anti-violence projects led by CSA survivors, such as the organization Generation 5, named for its vision of ending child sexual abuse in 5 generations, have been developing models and frameworks calling for strategies that support immediate intervention when CSA is occurring, that address the social and political conditions that make child sexual abuse more likely to occur, and refuse carceral approaches that sustain rather than interrupt sexual harm. Practices of truth-telling, accountability, and healing are linked in Black feminist and womanist Christian social ethics, an insight that is also reflected in the exchange between a woman who engages in truth-telling, perhaps about the harms that she has experienced at the hands of others, and not only about her healing at the moment of her physical and psychological healing by Jesus. Liberatory anti-violence movements lift up practices of truth-telling and accountability as a loving and healing force with the potential to transform those who have experienced harm and are responsible for harming others, many of whom are also survivors of violence. And I'm not going to go into a kind of other face of love that is especially emphasized and important when we think about this, which is the transforming power of love and a belief in the transforming power of love. Jimmy and Hannah have spoken to that just a bit in their presentations on faith and hope. Black feminist and womanist ethicists and theologians emphasize the necessity of dialogical engagement, that is being in dialogue, right, with others. And so kind of looking beyond the quote unquote kind of Christian ecclesial communities, looking beyond that in terms of other even religious communities, but being in dialogue with many partners, including here I say those in social movements. And in this presentation, I placed women of color-led organizing in state and intimate violence, partly in dialogue with womanist and Black feminist theological discourse in order to expand the understanding and movement of love as the practice of freedom within Christian religious communities and beyond. Liberatory anti-violence movements embody multiple faces of the ethic of love, including choice and creativity, and love as truth-telling and accountability. My examples suggest that liberatory anti-violence praxis enfleshes Black feminist and womanist Christian conceptions of agape love, quote, the kind of love that embraces everyone for the purposes of healing, change, and liberation. And here I'm quoting from womanist theologian Cheryl Townsend Gilkes. And furthermore, I want to end by urging that participation in liberatory anti-violence movements can function as a pedagogical space in which followers of Jesus, as well as many others, can be formed and discipled in concrete practices of a liberatory ethic of love, or to use Hook's words, love as the practice of freedom. So I'm going to close there to give us time for some discussion. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for this very multidisciplinary, dynamic presentation that has been so creatively framed by the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. And so I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we'll have in a bit. We have about 10 minutes for questions and comments. And so please, I invite you to raise your hand if you have anything that you'd like to ask our presenters today. Well, as we wait for hands, I might begin and use my moderator's privilege and ask you all, I sense in all three of your presentations this like tension between an already and a not yet, this world that we are imagining, that we hope will be possible, and these kind of glimpses of hope, so to speak, glimpses of love, glimpses of faith. And so I was wondering if you could share a bit more about what those fragments look like. I'm thinking here in particular of Christina Sharp's work of what it means to live in the wake of catastrophe, of slavery, of colonialism. What are those glimpses of light that you see in each of your respective presentations?
I think I might start to say that I think those glimpses of light are what are happening when people come together. And I hesitate to say this is a particular thing because it can take such a variety of forms, everything from building, better structures of love with accountability in our families, in our communities, in our churches, even outside of any sort of criminal behavior, but also, or serious harm that's criminalized, but also looking at everything from our solidarity with incarcerated people in their own organizing, our solidarity with those who are criminalized, our work around reentry. And so I really take comfort in the breadth of possibilities, that it's everything from what we teach our children about punishment or accountability to how we're working in the sort of more overtly political sphere, that all of those are these moments of kind of participation in this future that's coming. I tend to emphasize the already over the not yet.
I can share next. I think that for me, and this is also to kind of connecting to these notions of hope and faith. In terms of the already, I think it is the increased visibility of options, particularly when I think so often it's very easy to move toward punishment when we are considering harm that has happened at the hands of people who we're not connected to. But it's much more difficult to do that when we're considering harm that happens in our local communities. For example, that is something that comes up in congregational context, something that comes up in our families. And then there's this binary between punishment and neglect. Let's just silence it and deny it and ignore that it's happening. And so what options that we're seeing in the already are options that don't fix it, kind of fix us along, that provide us something that it doesn't freeze us into those two options of punishment or neglect. All right. And then the other thing I think in the not yet is that for many of us, I think is that there still is much work to be done to really understand, which is kind of partly connected to why we're here, that to understand this through the lens of our faith, kind of in terms of ethics and praxis. And I think another piece of that is that there is still so much to be realized and even to be experienced. We might know about something, but not know what does it mean to realize it, and actually how do we also shift social and political conditions and cultural conditions that also are necessary in addition to our individual and kind of small collective actions.
A phrase that I think about when I think about the now but not yet is, right, the breaking in part, and language that comes through in the communities I'm a part of, in the research that I do, is regular reference to experiment, right? So you might catch a glimpse of something that seems almost magical sometimes, right? And the next time you try it, it fails horribly, right? And accountability doesn't happen, or a new harm happens, right? And so if we think about experiment as these spaces where we have moments where alternative futures break in and their possibilities arise and we try them again. And sometimes we actually grasp a new way of being with one another, whether it's in a particular community of people or something more broadly that can be shared. And sometimes we don't, right? It's an analog and it's different, but I think about the work of communion, Lord's Supper, Eucharist as moments where there are times where that I have seen that build solidarity. I've seen that bring folks together, and I've seen churches split over it, right? And there's a breaking in that happens in moments where the divine enters this world, where the eschaton seems tangible, where all of that happens. And there are times where it's really hard to believe anything like grace is being mediated through that practice. I've been in churches that split over what cups were used and things like that, right? Like that's the kind of tradition out of which I come. And so but that doesn't mean that the power wasn't there. And that breaking in, that sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not, is something that I think about as an analog here, right? That we see those moments, but crucifixions still happen, but so do resurrections, right? And it's living into the possibilities of particular kinds of futures rather than others as we continue to experiment, right? I love the name of the podcast, right? It's a million experiments. It's not totally sure, but in all of them, something might be learned or seen or touched.
Thank you so much for those expansions. We have about 5 minutes left for more questions or comments. If anyone has something on their mind, please, I invite you to raise your hand and share. Yes, Kimberly.
Hi, thank you for your presentations. Very informative. I'm just wondering if you had a chance to have any dialogue with some of the writings of Pope Francis in Laudato Si, and in particular Fratelli Tutti on solidarity. He talks about a theological concept called communitarian salvation. And I heard someone quote it this morning in one of the presentations. It's the idea is behind it is no one is saved alone. We are saved in the sense that every person in the community feels held and like they belong to within this sort of circle of support. And so with that kind of description of salvation, how might that inform some of your work?
I don't want to take up too much space, but I want to lean in hard. I think some of the work that's happening in transformative justice spaces is trying to build the visibility of the interdependence that already exists with folks, right? So I think about Father Oro Bator, who wrote an article for the National Catholic Reporter when Fratelli Tutti came out, called Fratelli Tutti's Ubuntu by Any Other Name. And working with Desmond Tutu's theology and ethics is something that's I've been doing. And I just want to name, I've been seeing those resonances as well. I don't know that I have a comprehensive answer, but one of the things that I think transformative justice work does in creating community accountability, mutual aid, building solidarity is actually helping us see the interdependence that current systems obscure from us, and then inviting us to live into that interdependence in different ways that I think might resonate with some of the impetus I hear in your question. But I saw Hannah want to say something too.
Well, I might jump in to speak specifically about that sort of work of accountability and to look back at that staircase of accountability, which is aimed at the person trying to be accountable for harm. But I think it's really important to emphasize that an accountability process has to start with a sort of communal solidarity with the person who is being accountable. And that a real key insight for me from transformative justice is that people cannot begin to take accountability for having done harm without a supportive community. That if you are overcome by exclusion and shame, it is almost impossible to take accountability, which is part of why prisons and the carceral system do not work. And so I think that idea that there's a baseline communal solidarity, that the community has to be willing to hold space for accountability in order for any sort of more individual process of repentance or reparation to occur, is really essential as well.
Thank you. If Jimmy, you could write that resource, Fratelli Tutti's Ubuntu by No Other Name.
I just put the link in the chat. Yeah.
Oh, great. Thanks.
Yeah. But I you know, drawing on what Hannah was saying, right? One of the big criticisms of current incarceration practices, at least in the United States, is the ways that it separates people from communities, right? And the harm that comes from those separations, and saying what we need to do is not put people away where they are removed from their connections and communities of support and opportunities to repair harms that they've done, but actually to have the kind of communities where folks can do that work in community with one and actually lean in to doing that together, so that the healing is communal as well. So then the justice is communal, right? It's one of the big critiques, is the ways we actually aren't often doing that.
Gustave, I saw your hand as well.
Yeah, it is. Just also to thank the presenters. These papers were amazing. It's just about information. I know that in the past, actually in the recent past, movements in the church and theologians who worked in social justice and anti-violence movements were suspected by church leadership. I'm sure not only in the Catholic Church. And I would like to know, how much support do they get now? Do they still have to work on a personal basis, or do they get support from church leadership? Because I know, like the nuns, the nuns in the States who were working in that were, I would say, persecuted by the church leadership. I wonder if today things are much better, and if that goes beyond the Catholic Church.
I think I would say there has definitely been movement towards acceptance, particularly of maybe the restorative justice sort of paradigm for dealing with harm, within the Catholic Church and within mainline Protestantism, which is more the tradition where I work. I do think that the sort of really clearing that radical bar of abolition is still a little bit of a harder lift in the church. And that's not to say that it's not happening. There certainly are abolitionist spaces and voices, but sort of, I think living into that kind of future is still proving to be a little bit of a challenge.
Well, many thanks again to our three presenters. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you so much for inviting us to meditate on these questions, on these multiple ways for entering into theology, listening to social movements, but also to the quotidian nature of what it means to resist and to have faith, hope, and love, not only for ourselves, but for our communities. Everyone, we're going to reconvene again at 2:30 for our first special session from the Dignity, Equity, and Justice Committee. So that, again, that's 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thanks and see you soon.